Tonight we're to serve to provide you with the information needed to vote for your congressional representative on November 6th. You'll have the opportunity to hear from both your candidates, Republican nominee Warren Davidson and Democratic nominee Dr. Vanessa Enoch. Our purpose tonight is for you to learn about your candidates and their perspective on important issues facing our area. Tonight for our structure, so we are taping this, and I cannot stress this enough, it's important that you keep all noise to a minimum. So we're encouraging you do not clap, you do not raise the ruckus. You will be escorted out if that happens. So let's keep it all civil here. We're here to learn and listen from our candidates. We're going to cover a range of topics here with our moderators, and then we'll also have audience questions. So when you first came in, you should have been given a note card at any time. You see the gal over there, Colette. Just raise them up. She's going to get those for you. Our moderators tonight are Dr. John Foran, the chair of the Department of Justice and Community Studies here at the Regionals, and Mr. Mike Pittman, our politics reporter from the Journal News. All of our answers are going to be timed this evening, so we'll have 2 minutes for opening statements, they'll have 2 minutes per question, and 30 seconds are allowed for rebuttal and follow-up. Closing statements will be 1 minute. We just did the coin toss. We will have candidate Davidson will go first in the opening statements. Candidate Enoch will go answer the first question, and candidate Enoch will then go first in the closing statements. Okay, now with your note cards, as you sort of gather them, we'll make sure that the moderators get them, but due to the fact that we have only an hour this evening, we might not get to all of your questions. Because of that, we've encouraged our candidates to join us for coffee and cookies out in the lobby afterwards. So if we don't get to your questions tonight, we would encourage you to join us out there so we can continue this conversation. Our debate will end today at 8 o'clock and then after our closing statements. If you could, just sort of because we are taping, if you can shut your cell phones down there on silence, because we want to make sure that we kind of keep the room to hear what our candidates have to say. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor for 2 minutes for opening statements.
Hi, I'm Congressman Warren Davidson. 2 years ago, I became the representative for this district. It's an honor to represent our district in Congress, and I think for a lot of people, quite unexpected. It's been a real joy to get to know so many people. It's really hard to get to know three-quarters of a million people. We've made a good effort at it, and I think that's been one of the best parts of the job, connecting with people all around the 8th District. And I look forward to your questions tonight, but I've really enjoyed the chance to go to Washington, D.C. and be able to get results. We've passed laws. If you look back at President Trump, he set a tone of trying to get rid of 2 regulations for every new one launched. And the reality is, with Congress working together with the President, we've gotten rid of 23 regulations. We've simplified the tax code, we've reduced the regulatory burden, and the results are the economy is growing at more than double the rate that it was growing before. When people believed that that was the new normal, we've set a new standard. And unfortunately, despite the tremendous growth rate of the economy, it's been exceeded by the growth rate of spending. So we have plenty of challenges left, and I'm asking for your vote and the opportunity to continue fighting for results that represent our district. Thank you.
Let me first of all thank Miami University Regionals and the Journal News for hosting this debate. And thanks to all of you for being here, especially those who traveled quite far to get here. I've traveled throughout the 8th District, knocking on doors and listening to constituents in all 6 counties. I find the #1 concern for residents across the district is how to deal with the high cost of healthcare and prescription drug prices. What I've witnessed from those in leadership, including Mr. Davidson, is that their response to the needs of those of us who don't pay for their seats in Congress has been slow. And in most cases, the response only came after they found their seats challenged by those of us who made it a point to listen to the residents of the district. While he was busy passing legislation to eliminate the protections for pre-existing conditions from the Affordable Care Act, he ignored the fact that 302,000 non-elderly people in this district had pre-existing conditions. He voted to end your grandmother's arthritis coverage and your son's asthma medicine. Mr. Davidson advocated for separating families at the border and supported the idea that somehow nursing moms provided a national security threat and should therefore be separated from their families. Since being in office, Davidson has chosen to brand himself as someone who supports those who turn a blind eye to issues concerning women and children. Davidson's explanation for his decisions is that it's not compassionate to bankrupt America. But what really isn't compassionate is passing permanent tax cuts for the wealthiest 1% and then gutting your Social Security and your Medicare to pay for it. We need new leadership in Congress, leadership that can empathize with you, relate to you, and who will fight for the changes that you want to see. I'm Dr. Vanessa Enoch, and I'm asking for your vote on November 6th.
Good. All right. Thank you both for joining us here this evening. I'd like to start with a question about the federal budget deficit that will ultimately be for both of you. Earlier this week, the Treasury Department reported that the federal budget deficit for the fiscal year that just ended on September 30th was $779 billion, which is up 17% from the previous year. And the data released by Treasury suggests that the deficit was driven not just by higher federal spending, which did go up in dollar terms, but actually dropped as a share of the overall economy, just a bit. It was also driven by a pretty dramatic slowdown in the tax revenues that came into the federal government through the tax process. And this drop in tax revenues was most dramatic on the corporate side, corporate tax revenues, which dropped by about a third in the last fiscal year, about $92 billion, according to the Treasury. And some analysts, and this is a topic of debate, some analysts are attributing this drop primarily to the tax law that was passed, Congress passed, President Trump signed in late 2017, that reduced the top corporate rate from 35% to 21%. So given that background, Dr. Enoch, first of all, if you're elected in November, and you mentioned taxes in your opening statement, what do you intend to try to do there to address the issue of the budget deficit? Do you intend to try to repeal tax cuts? Do you intend to cut spending? What is your plan on that? If you could speak to that. And we have 2 minutes, is that right?
First and foremost, I think that policy decisions should not be a knee-jerk reaction. I think when this particular Congress decided to make those cuts to the wealthiest 1%, that they didn't consider the impact to the rest of us. In fact, most of us already struggling could not afford to have over $1 trillion deficit added to our budget. But what I advocate for doing in order to improve on that circumstance is to ensure that we continually lift the burden from those of us who are already struggling and make sure that the wealthiest 1% aren't the only ones benefiting from what's happening in Washington, D.C.
All right, thank you. Congressman Davidson, you voted for the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, and you've called the national debt America's most urgent problem. So given your past support for tax cuts, do you still stand by those votes? And if so, how do you intend to deal with the ongoing budget issue?
Yeah, so the challenge isn't that Americans are taxed too little, it's that the country spends too much money. So what's not compassionate is the stagnant economy that was told to the American people that was going to be the new normal. Stagnant wages, take-home pay has been stagnant for more than a decade. And the economy's got that changing. It's got real results for everyone in America. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act benefited everyone in America. In our district, the average family over the decade that these tax cuts are in place will save $26,000. $26,000. So to take that away is essentially saying we're going to take $26,000 away from you. What we really need to do is prioritize spending. And there are a lot of good causes. Almost everything that comes in is like, yes, this is also a good cause. Yes, it'd be nice to help this situation. But just like in a household budget or a business budget or even a state budget with a balanced budget amendment, you have to prioritize spending. The reality is we're spending more than 5 times as much on interest as we are on infrastructure. And we've got to change that. We've got to prioritize taking care of our country.
Another hot topic, hot button issue are tariffs. President Trump's approach to trade with other, and the president's approach to other trade with other nations. We are hearing more and more about the effects of these tariffs on consumers and small businesses. Last month, the National Retail Federation called the Trump administration's imposition on tariffs a tax on American families that threatens to weaken the American economy. Could each of you explain your views on the current U.S. trade policy, and where do you agree with the president, where do you disagree? Congressman Davidson, you are first.
Yeah, thank you. So as a manufacturing guy for about 15 years, I was on the receiving end of bad trade policy for a while. I certainly lived it. And when Donald Trump campaigned on fixing our broken trade deals, not only was I paying attention and excited about it, I was enthusiastically supportive, and I still am. It's time that we put America first in our deals. Just yesterday, he withdrew from a postal union commitment that goes back decades. And what did that do? It quit subsidizing shipments from China into the United States. So where I disagree with the president is when we put in uniform tariffs on steel and aluminum. We essentially taxed all the steel in the world, and the reality is there are 5 major steel makers in China. We could put sanctions on even 2 of those companies, which are shipping slabs into Canada, and it would be targeted. So as a military guy, everything we do to fight and win wars multiplies allies and instead of multiplying enemies. And it does everything possible to minimize collateral damage. If we put targeted sanctions against China, it would escalate things with China, but it would minimize the impact on our economy and on our allies, and we could unite to deal with the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is China has not lived up to their commitments as part of the World Trade Organization. They are not a market economy. They've not been recognized as a market economy by anyone in the world, and it's time that they honor that commitment, and we quit ignoring the problem.
Thank you. Dr. Enoch.
In talking to farmers, for example, in Darke County, one of the challenges that they already was facing was declining profits. And one of their concerns when the tariffs were passed is how that would impact them. And I think that this current Congress did not take into consideration the impact to this district, and we didn't have representation who would fight for the concerns of the residents of this district. So as I look at the policies, the trade policies, as a congressperson, what I intend to do is to make sure that I fight vigorously for the people of this district, especially with regard to things that are going to impact their bottom line. Farmers have continually expressed that they're already struggling. They're not interested in handouts from the government. They want to be able to participate in the free market and to sell their goods. They're not interested in receiving a monthly welfare check from the government. So as a congressperson, they will be my priority. You will be my priority in this room. I'll listen to you, and the decisions that I make will be those decisions that will most benefit the people in this room.
Congressman Davidson, I know you want to rebut, but is there an area where you agree with the president, or obviously you disagree, but is there an area that you agree with what he's done?
I oftentimes, as I think about the foreign policy of this current president, there are things that I would say definitely need to happen. I don't totally disagree that tariffs are sometimes necessary. I think in this particular instance that those tariffs were not targeted, and because they were not targeted, the impact was great. And so therefore, I think if we had a Congress who was willing to aggressively fight for the people of their district, then we would not have had the kinds of tariffs.
All right, Congressman Davidson, 30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you. So there's really no one in Congress that's been more vocal about tariffs than I have. So when you look at it, the authority for tariffs is Congress's. Congress gave it away to the president. So I've co-signed every letter to try to change direction on the things that I disagree on, which is uniform tariffs. I've met with members throughout the district at every kind of company, every size. I've helped people get exclusions to the tariffs and help make that exclusion process work.
That's quick.
And there we we go. Okay. In the nature of these things, you kind of hop from topic to topic. So I'd like to shift to gun control and gun policy if I can. Gun regulation is an area where clearly there are differences between the two of you. And the NRA, for instance, has given Congressman Davidson an A and Dr. Enoch an F in their scoring. So let me start with Dr. Enoch. Could you explain, the same question for both of you basically, could you explain your position on the federal regulation of firearms? How far should it go? For instance, should bump stocks be banned by Congress? Is there a role for Congress in banning firearms at all? What's your view on this? Could you go first? Thanks.
First of all, I do support the Second Amendment. I grew up in a household with a gun-toting grandma in the country, and I definitely believe that we need to ensure that people have the ability to protect and defend themselves. I also believe that we need sensible gun legislation. It concerns me when we begin to talk about arming teachers and those kinds of ridiculous things instead of actually dealing with what the problem is. I would advocate for sensible gun legislation, and in terms of ensuring that things that high-capacity magazines, bump stocks, trigger cranks, and those kinds of things, that we discuss legislating those kinds of things, because I also believe that people should have the right to assemble in public places without the concern that some trigger-happy person is going to be able to come out and take them all out in a matter of minutes.
All right, thank you. Congress?
I favor no new restrictions to federal gun laws. I support and defend the Second Amendment unequivocally. The National Firearms Act has been in place since the 30s, and it bans machine guns. Assault weapons aren't machine guns. They're semi-automatic weapons that look similar to military weapons. They're not the same thing I carried as an infantryman. Having said that, I think one of the most important challenges, given the sentiments that are shared by some people, is to advance legislation that does do that protects the ability of Americans to keep and bear arms. One of the bills that hasn't made it across the finish line in the Senate is reciprocity, so concealed carry reciprocity. So when you go through the extra effort to get a concealed carry permit in a state, and you go through a state like Illinois, which has horrible gun laws, you're effectively disarmed. Frankly, we're less safe in this building than we would be if this wasn't a gun-free zone. As for schools, I really feel that it's wrong-headed to think that there should be a national policy. I don't favor a national curriculum, a national lunch menu, a national bathroom policy, and I certainly don't think every school should have the same safety policy. Right here in Butler County, we've got Michael Bloomberg trying to decide what Madison can do with their high school, and I think the citizens of that school district should be making that decision. I don't even think it would make sense to have the same policy across Butler County.
Can I just follow up on that, actually? Would you, this raises an issue of federalism, ultimately. So applying that to gun policy should, not at the federal level, but at the state or local level, if local citizens in a community want to ban weapons, would you support that? Or should they have sort of the home rule ability in those areas to ban assault weapons or ban?
Well, they have the ability to do it within a certain reason, but it's in the Bill of Rights for a reason. So they couldn't do that any more than they could ban free speech or ban freedom of religion. You can't say, oh, well, we're Catholic here, you can't allow Protestants to assemble here. And you can't do that for the Second Amendment either. That's part of what the civil liberties protected in the Bill of Rights are all about.
All right, moving on to a different topic here for opioids. Opioids are killing Americans at a high rate. More than 63,000 Americans died in 2016 from drug overdoses, according to the CDC, and more than 4,800 Ohioans died in 2017, according to the Ohio Department of Health. Senator Portman has been one of the loudest voices on this topic in D.C., who's introduced and passed legislation. He said back in August on the Senate floor that opioids is not only the #1 cause of death for Americans under the age of 50, but is now the #1 killer in Ohio. Ohio is one of the worst states nationally when it comes to overdose deaths, and Butler County, which is the largest county in the 8th Congressional District, is number 3 in Ohio, percentage-wise, when it comes to opioid deaths. So talk about what Congress should or can do to address this opioid addiction. What should that do to address the underlying issue of addiction? Congressman Davidson.
Yeah, thank you. It has been an honor to be able to be there and vote for many of the bills, 57, I think, total through the House. And They're all bundled up into a bill that the president's going to sign next week that did finally make it through the Senate. And Senator Portman has certainly been a strong voice there in the Senate for it. And so what do most of those bills do? You go back to the end of 2016, 21st Century Cures. It puts money into our Medicaid program to help fund recovery. It gives that money to states. Right now, though, if you look at the money that goes to states, it's allocated on a dollar basis. Like each state gets this many dollars for this purpose and this many dollars for that purpose, this many for kids, this many for development and disabilities. The healthcare bill that the House passed gave that as a block grant to the states on a per capita basis. I wish it was on a per citizen basis, but the beauty of the per capita allocation is that states like Ohio that have a bigger addiction crisis than, say, states like Utah, can allocate their money differently. And where states like Florida that maybe have a bigger geriatric population could allocate more for that. And it gives the flexibility that federalism, the republic that our founders created, and it recognizes the big diverse country that we have, and it lets governors govern. And I think that's the right balance. It sets the clear signal that it is a federal priority, but it leaves flexibility for state and local governments.
Dr. Enoch.
Well, I advocate for a policy that would treat people with opioid addictions. I think, like with most policies, our congressperson, as well as the rest of the Congress, was a little late to responding to the opioid addiction crisis, and it ballooned. It got out of control. That's why the idea of getting rid of healthcare, of gutting our healthcare system, is a concern. Because without healthcare, how do you take care of a drug addiction problem? As it relates to healthcare, our congressperson actually didn't even want our veterans to have insurance. He said that veterans were moochers who wanted healthcare insurance. That's a concern. I think that if we're to solve the healthcare problem, the healthcare crisis, that one of the things we have to do is to take issues seriously up front and not wait until people start pushing back against what you're already doing.
Congressman Davidson, you would like to respond? Remember, 30 seconds goes quick.
Yeah, so let's be clear. Veterans are entitled to the care that they've earned. I've not only asked for veterans to have veterans health care, I've asked for members of Congress. The first bill I submitted said Congress will have no other health care benefit than the VA health benefit. We've had good reforms and good wins to help veterans there, and we've had good wins on health care. So I've been a strong advocate for that. Unfortunately, with any federal program, there are people who will lie, cheat, or steal to get things they have not earned. And those people are dishonest folks, and they shouldn't get things they haven't earned.
Thank you very much.
All right, I'd like to move us to the issue of climate change that's been in the news recently. Earlier this month, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report that warned that the negative effects of global climate change are, first of all, they're already here, the argument was made there, and those effects could become truly catastrophic on a global scale. And to quote from the report, unless the leading industrialized countries make rapid, unprecedented, and far-reaching changes to how we use fossil fuels. U.S. policy, though, seems to be moving the opposite direction. So in 2017, for instance, President Trump withdrew us from the Paris Climate Agreement, and there's been some attempt to roll back environmental regulations. So for both of you, ultimately, and Dr. Enoch first, how concerned are you personally about this issue? As a personal matter, and secondly, what kinds of environmental policy changes would you like to see, or domestic policy changes generally, to address this question?
First of all, just like many of the people in the district, I'm extremely concerned about this issue. We need to improve our infrastructure. We need to ensure that our bridges and roads are improved and that our sewage system is equipped for handling flooding and those kinds of things. Unfortunately, my opponent in defying all science and logic has been sending out letters to constituents that's against the logic of science, that says that climate change is real. And I think that that's a tremendous concern. You know, when it comes to predicting the weather, we all like to know that we should take an umbrella that day or that it's going to snow. And we trust science when it comes to those kinds of things. But when it comes to climate change, my opponent says climate change is not real. We know it's real. We need to be prepared for climate change. And some of those issues such as infrastructure development, should be a priority for this particular Congress.
All right, thank you. Congressman.
Yeah, so climate change is certainly an important issue for politicians to address because it's important to the people of the United States of America. But I am thankful that President Trump showed the leadership to say, we're withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. We're not going to subsidize the rest of the world. We're not going to pay for other people. We're not going to pay a tax on the success the United States of America had. In fact, there's only one country that actually hit the Kyoto protocols, and we didn't even commit to it. It's the United States of America. We did that because we have technological innovation in our country that's unparalleled. And I think that's the right thing. Technology is going to solve this. There are Luddites that would have us go back and everyone be Amish or something like that. Or no, wait, we got to buy this thing or that thing. Or no, you can't do this or we're going to tax that on you. And I really think that we need to put our economy out there. Diesel engines, for example, I think everyone believes they should have some sort of standard for how clean the emissions from engines are. Diesel engines are dirtier than gasoline engines. And so let's have a regulation. But the regulation for that's over 4,000 pages long. So this is what the EPA has been up to in more common sense regulation. I think if a professor handed that out and someone turned in a 100-page paper, you would probably look at the student and go, hey, I think you probably overthought this, man. I mean, you just need a basic standard. It's 4,000 pages long. And that hurts companies in our district, like our international plant, Navistar in Springfield. So I think we can get the right kind of regulation and still grow our economy, and we can still beat the world as the best place to do business and in a great environmentally friendly country.
All right, thank you. Dr. Enoch, you wanted to respond?
Yes.
30 seconds.
Thank you. I definitely am concerned about what our current legislator has done as it relates to environmental rollbacks. In fact, he voted he voted for a deregulation of some of the coal waste and those kinds of things. He actually voted for corporations to be able to, again, dump waste into our waterways. That's the water we drink.
All right, thank you.
Right. Switching topics again, and just we have a lot of questions from the audience. We're not going to get to all of them here. We will get to some of them here. But going to the Me Too movement, in light of the recent attention around the nation on questions of sexual harassment and assault, I want to ask about the federal role in addressing these issues, specifically the Violence Against Women's Act, which was originally enacted in 1994 and has been renewed regularly by bipartisan majorities, is set to expire on December 7th, unless Congress reauthorizes it. Among other things, the act provides additional funding for social service agencies that provide counseling and legal services for assault victims. Last month, also 46 House Republicans sent a letter to Speaker Ryan and Leader McCarthy requesting quick action on reauthorization. Now, Mr. Davidson, there were 6 House members that signed that letter that were from Ohio. You were not one of those 6. Can you talk about why you didn't join your colleagues in that and ask the leadership to take this up? And more generally, do you support an active federal role in addressing this issue?
I think we federalize too many crimes, frankly. I mean, I'm incredibly sympathetic to the cause of violence against women. I think it's important that our country stands unified, that it is a national priority. I've been encouraged by the Me Too movement, and frankly, I hope one of the lessons learned out of the Kavanaugh thing is while we hopefully as a country still uniformly embrace due process, women who have been or believe they've been victims of violence should go forward and should make the case and should not have to be subjected to ongoing abuse or even dealing with any past abuse without justice. But I believe that the right level for regulation is for all of our criminal statutes has been state unless there's an a federal activity there. And so while this is a sympathetic case, and while it's just a case of what should the federal government do, not whether it's a priority or not. So would I vote against it? Probably not. But is it something that I'm like a passionate advocate that the federal government pass a law? No, because every state has a law against it already.
Let me just follow up on that actually. If we could separate the question of criminal penalties and just then federal support for clinical services and counseling and that kind of thing.
Right, those kinds of things are great. I think that's something that makes sense at the federal level, and that, again, you know, if it's part of the allocation of money and it goes as part of the block grant for monies that go to the state can run their own program there.
Dr. Enoch.
So as you already stated, this current Congress refused to authorize the Violence Against Women's Act, and it had to actually be, they had to delay the vote again for December 1st. But this particular act was one of the most effective pieces of legislation enacted to end domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. It also offered protections for women asylum seekers. Rather than voting to extend these protections for women, this current Congress instead chose to simply kick the can down the road. And I think that Sheila Jackson Lee's intent in ensuring that some of those provisions got in there was what we were already seeing as it relates to the needed protections for women. And so it concerns me that our congressperson did not care enough about women to make sure that he fiercely advocated for women as it relates to the Violence Act.
All right, thank you. Moving to a different topic. We've had several questions from the audience about healthcare, so let me sort of pull all of those questions together into a single big question, basically. So think of it this way. I mean, the question of the federal role in healthcare. So there are critics on the left, there are critics on the right. So we have some folks arguing that we should greatly reduce the role of the federal government in the healthcare industry, health insurance industry, in the Medicaid expansion that is part of Obamacare, in federal subsidies. There's a debate about pre-existing conditions, for instance. Then others argue that we should greatly expand the federal role, Medicare for all or single payer. So big question here, basically, and Dr. Enoch, could you speak to this first? What is your view on this? What is the appropriate federal role in healthcare in this country?
So every day I meet people across the district who are concerned about losing their health care. In the richest country in the world, I believe that it should not be a political statement to say that someone should or should not have to decide between making a copay and buying groceries. I would actually advocate for going further than the Medicaid expansion that's already been offered. In fact, I'm advocating for a Medicare X program, which would allow both the private industry to still exist and a public option. I know that my opponent has already said again that it's not compassionate to bankrupt America. And so as he sees this issue as an issue that would bankrupt America, we are America. We all deserve adequate health care, and this has been the #1 issue for people across this district. So as a congressperson, I would definitely fight to make sure that we have health care coverage for everybody in the district and across the country.
All right, thank you. Congressman.
As a small business owner, the companies I used to own, made things out of metal. The overwhelming expenditure in that company is metal. And the reality is, we would spend more hours in a given year negotiating our health insurance renewals than we would the metal. And why? Well, because the health insurance sector is highly consequential. It's always going up. There's no competitive market for health insurance. Metal sets up and clears quickly because they're subject to competitive forces. Health insurance companies are actually exempt from antitrust laws. Those are the laws that they abuse they use this exemption to abuse price signaling, market shaping. They block new entrants to the market. That's why almost uniformly everybody goes up. I don't know, what's it look like? 20%? I got 20%. Everybody raises. It's a complete absence of capitalism in the market. It's distorted by subsidies and price controls. And so the right role of the federal government should be that we end the antitrust exemptions. And when we had the chance in the House, we did. The House voted 416 to 7 to end antitrust exemptions. And it hasn't yet become law because the Senate hasn't taken it up. Why? Ask your senators why. Ask yourself why. But here's what a member of Congress who'd been there for 20 years told me. I said, why, if it would be popular with the public, if it would help solve a problem, and it passes 416 to 7, wouldn't the Senate vote on this? And he said, best I can figure, because it would pass. It's time for the Senate to vote.
All right,
I would say that one of the concerns that our congressperson has is that he's in the pockets of the private insurance providers. And so it would be very difficult for him to make a decision that would be in the best interest of the public. In fact, he had 74 times to vote in favor of the people of the district, and each and every time he voted with big business. So I think that that should be a concern for the people in this district as you make your decision to vote on November 6th.
Well, I certainly resent the argument that I'm in the pockets of anyone. But let's be clear, I'm advocating for an end to the antitrust exemptions that health insurance companies have. I think they're not seeing me as a friend or ally. I'm trying to end their little monopoly that they've got. So I don't get money generally from that sector. The insurance money I get, you should look at the lines of businesses they're in. They're in other property and casualty businesses from some of the folks that have supported us politically. But the health insurance sector needs more competition, not less. And we've got a tug of war going between the people that want the status quo and the alternatives.
30 seconds goes fast.
Yeah, people get to finish their sentences.
All right. We've had a few questions on immigration and human rights and foreign policy. So I'm going to try to meld this together here. As a member of Congress, will you have the opportunity, or you will have the opportunity to affect the nation's foreign policy and oversee the administration's conduct of foreign affairs? So let me ask each of you to comment on the Trump administration's towards foreign policies. For instance, do you approve of the president's relationship with our European allies, with Russia, and in light of the reported killing of a Washington Post columnist at the Saudi consulate in Turkey with Saudi Arabia? Mr. Davidson, Congressman Davidson, you go first.
Well, I think one of the best signals is who is the president trusted to lead our foreign policy efforts. Mike Pompeo, who was a tremendous pick as Secretary of State's doing an incredibly good job. And Nikki Haley was tremendous at the United Nations as our UN ambassador. She's finishing out her term there at the end of the year. I look forward to seeing who he picks. So the president generally trusts people to lead those efforts. The president's own conduct of foreign policy, ISIS is nearly extinct. We still have to finish the job. And I think we need to keep bringing the forces to bear. The focus needs improved in Syria. And I think Mike Pompeo is working on that right as recently as his most recent trip to the Mideast. And then when you look at North Korea, President Obama said that was our biggest issue. You look at it today. We've seen the hostages brought back all over the world, and we haven't negotiated with terrorists to do it. We withdrew from the Iran deal. I think the president's overall conduct of foreign policy is great. As for some of the rhetoric with the Europeans, he was called out for not speaking kindly to Angela Merkel. And in fact, what he did is he called out, she did an $11 billion deal with the Russians for natural gas, and then she wants to go on and talk tough. The reality is the administration has had tough policies, tough sanctions, the toughest ever since the end of the Cold War against Russia. But the reality is he uses rhetoric that is diplomatic. And so the Europeans don't like this because he's blowing up their little deals. We continue to spend money to defend Europe, and yet we are unappreciated. And I think we shouldn't have to pay for friends. And the president's doing a good job of ending that.
Dr. Enoch.
Could you repeat your question one more time, please?
All right. As a member of Congress, you'll have the opportunity to affect the nation's foreign policy and oversee the administration's conduct of foreign affairs. So I want you to comment on the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy. For example, do you approve of the president's relationship with the European allies, with Russia, and with Saudi Arabia in light of the Washington Post columnist?
You know, I thought for a minute when my mic went out, we were going to have to share mics and then prove that we can reach across the aisle and you know, I think that one thing that's very important, I do believe that we should reach across the aisle and collaborate. I think that until we stop the tug of war, that we're going to be challenged as a nation every couple of years, every cycle of the infighting. As it relates to whether or not I support the president's policies as it relates to foreign policy, I think that the Saudi Arabia issue and the journalist being killed is a perfect example of why we need leadership in Congress who are willing to challenge the president. That's why we have a checks and balances system. I think when you look at the history of Saudi Arabia and its human rights violations, that ignoring those is certainly not an effective solution to the problem. I think that as it relates to foreign policy, that we have to make good decisions that are going to benefit the entire country. And I think that when you make decisions such as those that have been made, in fact, I can't tell who our enemies are and who our friends are anymore. So when you talk about foreign policy, we really have to take a look at why our friends are no longer our friends and why our enemies are all of our enemies. And I think the president said it best the other day when he said that something about a deal, an arms deal that we have. I don't think that we should be taking arms deals into consideration when we're dealing with human rights violations. I think we need to stop and actually look at what's going on and to make good decisions that affect good public policy.
Respond.
Yeah, I would simply add that in terms of checks, one of the most important things that we could do is Congress clearly has the authority to declare war. Congress, the Federalist 69 lays that out really clearly. So the main distinction that our founders drew between a president and a king, besides an election, was that Congress would actually have the authority on making war. The commander-in-chief, of course, commands, but Congress is the one that allocates it. Congress has been very passive-aggressive in this, and it's long overdue to vote.
All right, thanks. Let me move us to yet another topic, the federal minimum wage. And this is another area where the two candidates here seem to have differences. Let me start with Dr. Enoch. You've stated that you support raising the federal minimum wage to $15. Critics of that approach would argue, among other things, that this may be hard on lower-income workers, may lead to higher unemployment. What would you say to those critics, and why do you support that policy? And then I'll ask a different version of that question to the congressman.
Okay, so first of all, in California, when the minimum wage was raised, we didn't get the things that they're talking about that they're using as a fear tactic to prevent raising the minimum wage. I think what's important here is that we remember that people who are living on less than minimum wage or who are living on the minimum wage right now, or even close to the minimum wage, can't afford the basic necessities. People who work should have the dignity of being able to afford to live. I am challenged by this idea of not allowing people to have those benefits. Now, the benefit of actually being paid a livable wage. Now, one of the concerns I also have is that when we don't require employers to pay a minimum wage or a fair wage, it leaves the burden on the rest of us as taxpayers to subsidize these individuals who aren't making enough to live. We're subsidizing their housing, we're subsidizing their childcare, we're subsidizing their food, we're subsidizing their transportation costs. And so in order to ensure that employers are making an effort to pay their employees a livable wage, I think we have to require employers to raise the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour.
All right, thank you. And Congressman Davidson, let me reframe the same question, basically. You're quoted in the Journal News Voter Guide as saying that you oppose all federal wage controls. So could you clarify that? Are you opposed to a federal minimum wage in concept, or just
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
raising?
I just don't think, our country's so big and diverse, I don't think we could have one wage that would matter in Ohio and in California. Why is $15 work in San Francisco? Well, the cost of living is massively different in San Francisco and in Hamilton, Ohio. And so it's all kind of well-intentioned but wrong-headed. And I had a young man who was an apprentice toolmaker in my former company. And he was early on into this, 20, 21 years old, and he wanted to know, well, how long till I make as much as the shop foreman? And I said, the good news is I can tell you right now. And he's like excited. I said, I just have one question. How long till you can do all the things the shop foreman can do? He said, well, that'll take most of my life. I said, well, that's your answer. Because the reality is, if you can do all the things the shop foreman can do in 6 months, if I won't pay you as much as him, someone else will. We have a very competitive economy. We have more open jobs right now than people to fill the open jobs. So that's how you do this. You drive the economy to grow, and that drives wage growth. And that's what's happening in the economy right now. Even Barack Obama can't deny the economy is growing in today. He wants credit for it. The very economy that people go out and try to deny.
All right, thank you. Dr. Enoch, you want to respond?
You know, I'm concerned anytime somebody says that they don't believe that we should have a federal minimum wage, it puts me in the mind of the mass incarceration system. People who would agree with that would say, you know, it's okay to incarcerate people and pay them 35 cents an hour to do jobs that used to pay a good living, a good wage on the outside of prison. People who are incarcerated now are doing those jobs that many of us used to make a good living doing. They're doing agricultural jobs, manufacturing jobs, and all kinds of jobs.
Great. 30 seconds goes fast.
But I don't see the connecting the dots there. I'm for people serving time who've committed crimes. But I do think we should have some sentencing reform. We had a great second chance program in our businesses, and roughly 20,000 people in Ohio get out of jail every year. The average sentence is 2 years. I hope more employers give them a second chance.
All right, thank you.
All right, moving back to immigration, we had a couple of immigration questions too. Couldn't really tie them together neatly, so let me ask this. President Trump's immigration policies have been controversial throughout his presidency. Please talk about those policies. Where do you think the president has gone right with his issues, and where has he gone wrong? I think Congressman Davidson, I think you are up.
Yeah, so I think that the country's ignored this problem for far too long. Congress has worked hard on it. Unfortunately, back in February, it became a one-sided issue where one party decided that they were going to continue to resist at all costs through the election. But this is highlighted because in July, the House passed a bill that barely got enough votes to get a majority of Republicans. And I spoke with some of my Democrat colleagues, some of them who've become friends, and I said, you know, surely some of you guys are going to vote for this. I mean, it's barely even going to get a majority of the Republicans. It's the most moderate bill that the president has said he would sign. Anything more moderate, he says he'll veto. It gave amnesty to like 5 million people. It solved the DACA problem, it solved the border issue, but it built a wall. And Democrats wanted to keep the issue, so they 100% voted no on the most moderate bill the president signed, and it said he was willing to sign. And I said, well, how are you guys going to do that? What are you going to tell the DACA folks? And they said, well, there's going to be a blue wave. And I said, okay, let's say you're right and there's this blue wave. The president isn't going to sign your blue wave bill. I mean, he's just not. So you're going to tell those people that they have to wait until 2021. The Republicans have continued to extend compassion to people that want to be here. I bet every single person here is proud and honored to be a citizen of the world's land of opportunity. People come from all over the world. We're an incredibly welcoming country, especially if you do it legally. And that's what we need to do. We make it easier to be here legally and almost impossible to be here illegally. We need to end sanctuary cities, and the president's done a great job of putting that pressure on cities and states to end sanctuary behavior that creates a bigger problem, and it's not compassionate.
Thank you very much. And I do have a follow-up, but Dr. Enoch, if you'd like to, 2 minutes.
First of all, you ask what I agree with the president on. I do agree that we have to secure our borders. I believe that in securing our borders, that we have to ensure that the policies that we're making are humane. One of the issues that I have with the president's immigration policies is that the policies that were in place were already working. We saw a decline every year since 2008 with the number of people who were coming into this country illegally. So why the president decided to enact a policy that would, take children off of the breast of a nursing mother concerns me. I think that we need to ensure that whatever policies we pass, that we pass them with people in mind in a very humane fashion. I don't think it should be a partisan issue as it relates to making humane policy. I think that this current Congress has made everything a partisan issue, and that's a concern for me, because all of us are Americans, regardless of your party affiliation. And I think that if we remember that we can come together, have good solutions, and make good policy that's going to benefit America.
Congressman Davidson, you have a 30 seconds.
Yeah, just say briefly, there's only one party that decided to brand themselves the resistance. So we can see who made it a partisan issue in Congress. As for the immigration policies at the border, absolutely, border security is national security. I wish that was a nonpartisan issue. Unfortunately, that's one of the partisan issues. We have to secure the border. And frankly, if we can't detain and arrest people who come here illegally, how will we have a secure border? And so we need to do that.
Dr. Enoch, and then we'll move on after this.
So working together, I believe, means listening and considering the voices of even those people you disagree with. The people who resist are resisting because people aren't hearing their voices. You personally, sir, actually came to Congress out of a resistance movement, the Freedom Caucus. In fact, resistance is as American as apple pie. John Boehner called the Freedom Caucus the resistance group, and he said that they're idiots, anarchists, and so on and so forth, words I can't even use on stage. But I think that it's
Great, thank you. We'll move on from this. Thank you.
All right, we are quickly running out of time, but you can't be on a college campus and not have a question about education. So let me move to that actually, and about the federal role in higher education in particular. Right now, student loan debt makes up the second highest category of consumer debt held in the United States, more than car loans, more than credit cards. Only mortgage indebtedness is a higher balance ultimately. And the student loan burden carried by Ohioans is especially high. According to Forbes magazine, Ohio is 7th in the nation in total student loan debt, with 1.7 million Ohioans, which is over 10% of the population, carrying a total of $53.5 billion, which works out to an average debt load of about $31,000 for each student who's indebted. So given that context, and Dr. Enoch, let me ask you first, as a candidate for a House seat, do you see this as a problem that ought to be addressed by the national government, by the federal government? And if so, what are your ideas on how to address it?
I definitely see it as a problem. As a single mom, I put my daughter through college. She graduated from college with a degree in economics about 2 years ago. And for even, a one-person income is just incredible to try and afford college. And it's not much better for two-parent incomes. And I think that the important thing is to ensure that every child in this country has the opportunity to be properly educated and to succeed. And I think that this current Congress, Mr. Davidson, along with some of his colleagues, voted against some of the things that would make college affordable, some of the payment options that would make college affordable for low-income students and students who maybe can't afford to go to college. I think that rather than making it more difficult for students to attend college, that we need to look at options that are going to help students attend college. And I think we can do that with the various loan options. And again, this is another issue where I believe that Mr. Davidson can't be objective, because while he argues that he doesn't take money from healthcare, he also takes money from the private student loan industry. So he can't be objective when it comes to student debt and student financing.
Let me just follow up on that though, because you were talking largely about sort of how people in the future will be able to pay for college. What would you say to the folks who are done with that and they're just carrying the debt with them? Is there a solution for that, or?
I definitely think that there is a solution, and I think that some of those solutions have been proposed in Congress, and I think that this current Congress has rejected some of those solutions, even as it relates to graduated payment options and options for people when you lose a job, for you to be able to have your payment suspended. Some of those things were in the provisions that our current congressperson voted against. And so I think that there are options. There have been options.
Okay, all right, thank you. Congressman Davidson.
Yeah, I do think it is a federal priority. It is a debt crisis. It's a debt bomb, and it's going off for individuals all over the country. They're struggling with it. And the federal government hasn't helped them. Frankly, here's how it works. Anything the government subsidizes gets more expensive. And then the government saddles you with debt. So if we enter into a negotiation, this is how subsidies work, and we say, how much would you pay for a semester of college? All right, 10,000? Okay, deal, 10,000 bucks, all right? And make it 15. Right, whoa, I thought we said 10. Oh yeah, 10 from you, 5 from the federal government. That's how subsidies work. And then, okay, you'll take out a loan. That's driving it up. And unfortunately, we let students, as a federal government, do things that no private lender would do. You wouldn't do that for somebody if you said, I will give you the exact same amount of money no matter what degree you get. I'll loan you the same amount of money for a degree in medieval art as a degree in chemical engineering. Well, why wouldn't you do that? Because your risk of default goes up based on what you choose. We do it at the same interest rate. Just to require counseling on that is stuck in Congress. Not even to change it, just to require that students are disclosed. The schools are working to block even counseling on that. So people need to know what they're signing up for and their likelihood of the career they choose and what they major in, being able to service that debt obligation. Thankfully, private student loans are legal. So when students do show good credit history and a job that can pay it back, rather than the higher interest rate that averages in everybody's ability to pay or failure to pay, they can go out and get better loans at lower rates because their risk of default is much lower than the average.
Let me just follow up. I just want to clarify to make sure it's clear. So would you support a policy that essentially says accessibility to federal student loans depends on the choice of major or depends on the choice of career? Or...
No, I'm a co-sponsor of a bill that requires counseling about that, and I think it should be taken into account. I think the way to start it would be that even at a small level, let's just say it was like 25 basis points or a quarter of a point, different based off of your major, just so that the student knows, like, you know, your risk of paying back $100,000 of student loans based off this major is different than your risk of paying back a student loan based off this, because the job that you're likely to get pays very differently, and the demand for that job is really different.
All right, we're going to have to move on because we are close to the end here. We want to ask one more question before closing statements. We now live in a time of very polarized time. Can you give an example of a time when you've changed your mind on a political issue to alter talking with somebody on the other side? We're going to limit this to a minute because we are low on time. And then also, can you give an example where you've taken a stand on an issue where that was at odds with the leadership of your own party or the leadership of where you stand? So, Congressman Davidson.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I would say is that one of the big things that I looked at differently in Congress when I got there was the role of the committee structure. Who does what in the committees, and while Republicans have had term limits, Democrats have had seniority only in that process. I've talked with a number of colleagues, and this is probably actually more Democrats support this than Republicans, would be a reform that the members of the committee themselves choose their chairman. So that, for example, if the members of the Financial Services Committee privately felt that Maxine Waters wouldn't be the best ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, they could choose someone else. Republicans do that. What happens right now is leadership picks the chairman. Leadership picks it. So who's the next chairman of Financial Services is going to be heavily driven by leadership. So that's one of the fights that we're going to have internally. And I would say one of the things that I disagree with leadership on is spending. I mean, we've overspent by a lot. I've been very vocal critic of the level of spending and voted no every chance I've got.
Thank you very much, Dr. Enoch. 1 minute.
You know, when I first started this journey, I began talking about wanting a Medicare for All program. And I did talk to people across the aisle as I was knocking on doors. And one of their concerns was we definitely need a program that promotes competition. I agree, competition drives down prices. That is why I then began advocating for the Medicare X program. So I was persuaded to ensure that we incorporate some of those private healthcare providers to ensure that, although there is, to ensure that we have the Medicare program as an option and not just as the only thing in existence. So
thank you very much. We are now going to closing statements. Dr. Enoch, you are first, and then we'll end with Congressman Davidson.
As I've stated throughout my discussions tonight, we have a current Congress who has been late to the party as it relates to the concerns of all of us in this room. I think that it's important that we elect someone to Congress who's going to take our best interests at heart. Somebody who's going to listen to you. Someone who's going to make sure that you have an advocate in Congress. Well, I'm the person who's going to go and make sure you have an advocate. Since starting this campaign, I've talked to people on both sides of the aisle. Even before running this campaign, I've worked on campaigns, worked with individuals from the other side of the aisle to ensure that they had good public policy and they make good public policy decisions. And so when it comes to being an advocate, that's what I want to go to Congress to do on your behalf. I want to advocate for you. So I want you to remember Doc Enoch when you go to the polls, if you have not already voted. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Congressman Warren Davidson, and it is truly an honor to represent our district in Congress. I'm asking for your vote to continue that service. It's service that I never thought I would have. Frankly, I enlisted in the Army out of high school and was really honored to get the chance to go to the United States Military Academy. Thought I would be a career Army officer, came out and got involved in the private sector. Started and grew and acquired several companies, and thought I would be a career business person. And when I had the chance to serve here, I took that chance and won elections. So thanks for the voters that gave me the chance to serve, and I ask for your vote in this election. It is a team sport. I want to thank my wife, Lisa, who is my #1 teammate, but we have a great team, including the current people that represent our district in the official capacity. And if you want to connect to our office in that capacity online at davidson.house.gov, please do. You can find our emails, social media, phone numbers, and physical addresses. So thanks, and please stay in touch. I will be around afterwards. God bless.
Thank you very much. Can we give it for our candidates?
Our invited candidates include the 51st State Representative, 52nd State Representative, 53rd State Representative, 54th State Representative, Butler County Commissioners, 8th Congressional District, State Senate, 7th District. So we hope you will join us at 7 o'clock next week to hear from your candidates on that slate. We will also host the U.S. Senate debate. We're hosting that at Hall Auditorium next Friday on the 26th. Tickets will go available next week starting on Monday. That will be in Oxford. However, you can watch it on Channel 5 at 7 p.m. It's going to be live broadcast by WLWT. I would like for you to stay and mingle. We have coffee and cookies out in the back. We hope that you get a chance to connect to your representatives. Also, early voting is happening, so I hope that you get a chance to go to the polls. Thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you so much.